Welcome everybody to another edition of BasketBrawl, presented to you by NBA Math, where only the best points survive. We're happy to announce we have our first ever sponsorship, as we are now the official game show of the Chicago Bulls, and that's not even the punchline. I'm Brian Sampson, your selflessly egotistical host. You can find me on Twitter at BrianSampsonNBA. To find NBA Math, check out our website at www.nbamath.com. or find us on Twitter at NBA_math. Also make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the old thumbs up button on this episode. The rules of BasketBrawl are simple. There are 7 total rounds where a question will be posed to start each round. For the first 4 rounds, each fighter will have an ample opportunity to state their case. At the end of the round, I will award a point to the winner based solely on the information that they provided during their deliberation. The last 3 rounds will be lightning style, which means each challenger will have only 30 seconds to state their claim. At the end of each 30 seconds, the adversary who went first will have a dire 10 seconds to combat their competitor and try to earn the victory for that round. Whoever has the most points at the end of 7 rounds wins. To begin, I introduce you to the challenger, Andy Bailey. Andy writes about the NBA for Bleacher Report and is a co-host for NBA Math's delicious podcast called Hardwood Knocks. Andy stands 6'7", can't touch a backboard, and does not think Rudy Gobert is a top 5 center. You can find him on Twitter at Andrew D. Bailey. Now, allow me to introduce the champ, Dan Favale. Dan put an old-fashioned whooping last week on his competitor, who shall remain nameless. Dan is a deputy editor at NBA Math, also writes about the NBA for Bleacher Report, and is the other co-host for the Hardwood Knocks podcast. My inside sources tell me there's some tension in the Hardwood Knocks locker room, with Dan actually sending out a tweet today stating, "I don't want to be here." However, it turns out he's talking about the nail salon he was at. Thanks for returning, champ. All right, so the first question that we're going to start out with is a question about the Boston Celtics. As most of you probably know, they lost a major player just a couple minutes into the game last week when Gordon Hayward went down with a catastrophic leg injury. Don't worry, we won't show any clips of that. So before Las Vegas had their win total of about 56.5 wins for the over-under. So the question that I'm posing to both of you is, what is the new over-under for Boston? Dan, you're going to go first. You picked 45 wins. Andy, you're going to go second. You have 41.5. So Dan, the floor is all yours.
45 wins almost seems ambitious for this team given where they are now. Their offense is not good, and they're scoring at a league-worst rate with Kyrie Irving on the floor. But he's not going to continue to shoot ice-cold percentages from 2. He's under 40% right now. We know that he had problems last time leading an offense without LeBron on the floor, but the Cavs were good on offense when Irving was by himself in 2015, 2016, according to NBA Wowie. Hart, RIP. I love NBA Wowie. And I think the one thing we need to keep in mind for Boston is they're relying a lot on inexperience right now. More than half of Irving's minutes have come with Brown, a sophomore, and Jason Tatum, a rookie, on the floor together. That's a crap ton, and these guys are going to get better. The Celtics still have a ton of switchy defenders. Marcus Morris will come back and help things. Al Horford's going to start shooting better from the field. We have to remember there's a learning curve involved here, and that the Celtics were probably overrated to begin with, but 45 in the East still feels like a nice sweet spot for them.
I feel like you made several points for me, Dan. So let me just start off with saying thank you. You opened by saying 45 seems ambitious, and I agree with you. You laid out Kyrie's struggles so far. I think relying on Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum so heavily is going to be a serious problem for them throughout the season. Yeah, they're going to get better over the course of the year, but I just don't trust them yet. And I was very thoroughly on the under for them even before Hayward went out, when it was at 55 or 56 or whatever it was. To me, they were a high 40s win team at that time, and I think their depth, I know it's only one player, but just watching them play a couple times this season, it's really hard to see where they're getting contributions past like the 6th or 7th guy on this roster. I know Kyrie Irving is a much different player than he was the last time he was the lead dog on a team. He's been through a lot in the last 3 years with LeBron. But let's not forget how bad the Cavaliers were when he was their top dog. I don't think it will be that bad, obviously. But to me, that this is going to be a very up and down season for the Celtics.
I don't think we can disagree that it's going to be up and down. And again, I'm not saying that 45 seems ambitious. I don't think it is because they play in the East and they're going to get better. How many wins is Brad Stevens going to be worth on his own once he gets used to this roster? And Kyrie Irving, he has his flaws defensively. He even has his flaws as an offensive player. But there was actually a game or two this year where like his problem was he was looking to pass too much. You look at his talent on the offensive end, you can build an above-average offense around him. Like, the Celtics are not going to hover near the bottom of offensive efficiency forever. And you just look at the East, and their depth is still pretty good. Aaron Baines has been fantastic for them as well. And you have to look at how some of these players, Jaylen Brown's offense, that might regress to the mean a little bit, but some of these guys are going to improve. And I come back to Marcus Morris is going to be a big help for them defensively when he gets back in the lineup. And I'm sold on Baines. Al Horford, we know, is going to get better. And it's tough for me when you have a team with 2 All-Stars still after Hayward goes down, and then a coach like Stevens to predict less than 45 in a bare-bones Eastern Conference.
I am not sold on really anyone besides Kyrie Irving and Al Horford. I don't see how anybody – I think you said you're sold on Aaron Baines. Like, what has sold you about him?
He's just such this big presence, this good rebounder. He's going to set hard screens for them. And that's depth at the center position if they want to go traditional. Or if you're going to find yourself up against dual big teams, the Aaron Baines-Al Horford combination is not going to be bad. That works. And, yeah, I get it. They're relying on some unproven guys. But do you honestly think they're not going to hit on any of these guys this season? It's just you look at all these problems that they're having right now. Marcus Smart trying to run pick and rolls has been not good. Some of these things are going to correct themselves because not all of these things can go wrong. And if that's what they look like now this early in the season, given the depth and the talent that they have, I find it kind of hard to believe that they're going to stay in this malaise post-Hayward for that much longer.
I think Marcus Smart is an historically bad offensive player. Jaylen Brown is going to regress to the mean, like you said. Rookies are almost never efficient. That's Jason Tatum. That's like options 2, 3, and 4, basically. Al Horford's in there somewhere, but the offense is going to struggle for sure.
Al Horford's in there somewhere. I rest my case.
All right, I think I'm going to step in there. You guys both made really good points. Andy, I like how you're talking about with Kyrie struggling with the Cavs back when he was the primary option. And you almost had me there. I think for me, when I look at the team and hear your guys' arguments, I see those win totals being somewhere in between, because at 41.5, that's below 500, or right at 500, I guess it'd be. And so I just see it's hard for me to see a team, like Dan said, with 2 potential All-Stars in Horford and Kyrie, and then Brad Stevens as an X factor as well. So even though I think Dan's number is a little bit high, I think he made those couple extra points that got him this first point.
Get back to me in a couple months.
So with Dan leading 1-0, we're going to move on to the second question, which is who's the best under-the-radar All-Star candidate in the Western Conference? Andy's going to start us off this time. He has Rudy Gobert. Danny's going to go second, and he has LaMarcus Aldridge. Andy, the floor is all yours.
So I almost feel like I'm insulting Rudy Gobert, calling him under the radar. This guy was second-team All-NBA center last year. I feel like he was snubbed in All-Star voting. I feel like he was more deserving than Gordon Hayward. But to me, it was just sort of, let's pick a guy who has not been an All-Star yet. I feel like that was sort of my main criteria. And I think Utah, despite losing Hayward and George Hill, is still going to be pretty dang good this year. If you want to see why, just go back and watch them beat the Thunder the other night. That defense is going to, it's going to drive teams crazy. All 3 members of OKC's Big Three were visibly frustrated. I think it's going to happen night after night after night. And I think Rudy Gobert is obviously the anchor of that. And so he's going to get a lot of credit for their success on the defensive end. But he's also going to put up some big counting stats in terms of scoring this year, too. Post All-Star break last season, he averaged 17 points and 13 rebounds and shot 70% from the field. This preseason, which granted is the preseason, he averaged 23 and 14 per 36 and shot 74% from the field. Now, he's slowed down a little bit in these first 2 or 3 games of the regular season, but he has a very real chance to be the leading scorer of this team and the defensive anchor for a team that I think is going to be very much in the playoff come All-Star selection time.
So, I get the rationale behind Rudy Gobert, never been an all-star, but is it really under the radar if you're at worst, the second best, third best player at your position? LaMarcus Aldridge, I think you could argue coming into this year, was maybe top 8 at power forwards. And if you would have ranked him on... He's what? No, you know what? I'm going to get heated. No, but, with power forwards, he was maybe top 8? Top 9, and on centers, if you want to loop him in there, he probably would have ranked even lower. This is a guy, the Spurs questionably signed him to an extension, and he's just absolutely balling right now. We had questions about pretty much everything entering this year. Could he be able to carry an offense without Kawhi Leonard? His numbers were atrocious when the Spurs played without Kawhi Leonard, and now their offense can't function without him on the court. We're talking about a 72-minute sample size right now, but the Spurs are pumping in 111.5 points per 100 possessions with him in the game, compared to 70.3 without him. I don't care what the small sample size is there. There's been a shift. You look at what he's averaging entering that game against the Raptors as we record this tonight. He's at 26.5 points and 10 rebounds. This is a guy who's, with the Spurs anyway, has been kind of an understated stationary rim protector, and I'm just looking at last season. And yes, the Spurs put him in this position, but not everyone's going to be good in this position. 125 players defended at least 200 shots at the rim. LaMarcus Aldridge ranked 5th in points allowed per shot, behind Draymond Green, Rudy Gobert, Roy Hibbert, Joel Embiid. The top 2 basically just got to the bare minimum to qualify. This is a very good player, and it looks like he's going to turn into a two-way talent again, or just overall with the Spurs. And in the spirit of being under the radar, no one would have picked him to make an all-star team entering this season, and I think kind of after what happened in the preseason, his talk with Pop, and now what we've seen in the regular season thus far, he would have to be the easy pick for me.
He's a 5-time All-Star.
He's under the radar now, though. Is he? You're going to tell me that Rudy Gobert is more under the radar than Aldridge?
Most successful franchises in pro sports over the last 20 years. If Kawhi's not playing, they're going to put a Spur in the All-Star game, and who else would it be?
Are they going to put a Spur? Look at how far LaMarcus... They couldn't give LaMarcus Aldridge away, basically, on the trade market over the summer. And you know what? If you want to use that, fine. He's a 5-time All-Star, whatever.
And he was an All-Star his first year with the Spurs.
Yeah, but how is he more We're talking about this season. We're not talking about their career. You want to throw Mike Conley under the radar now, too, even though he's been snubbed 8 times in his career? It's just Rudy Gobert would have been more over the radar and more in-your-face pick than LaMarcus Aldridge entering this year, and I don't even think that's really close. And if you're going to concede that he wasn't, you have to tell me then that he's not in the conversation for best center in the NBA, if that's what you're going to concede. That's where I'm at.
All right, so I'm going to step.
Go ahead.
I'm going to step in here. So I think, Dan, you made a lot of good points about LaMarcus Aldridge and his offense this season and his under the radar defensive numbers. Like you pointed out, he is a really good rim protector and he uses his length very well. Unfortunately for you, Dan, I got to give this point to Andy. He had me when he brought up the point that LaMarcus Aldridge has made 5 All-Star games, and 5 All-Star games in the past 6 years. The only one missing out is last year, so it's hard for me to consider him an under-the-radar All-Star when, that's 5 right there. So Andy gets his first point.
Dan's question real quick. They don't even have centers in the All-Star selection anymore.
Right, what does that have to do with anything? You're going to say that LaMarcus you're going to tell me entering this season, LaMarcus Aldridge was higher on the potential All-Star totem pole than Rudy Gobert. If you're going to concede that, then you're basically conceding that Rudy Gobert is not the top center of the NBA.
So
blasphemy, as Stephen A. Smith would say.
With the score now 1-1, we're going to move into the third question, which is who is the best under-the-radar All-Star candidate in the Eastern Conference? Dan is going to start us off. He has Tobias Harris, and Andy is going to go second. He has Victor Oladipo. So Dan, the floor is all yours.
I'm happy that Andy can't throw a cheap shot at me for picking someone who's had an All-Star appearance this time. I'm going with Tobias Harris, who has not had an All-Star appearance in his career, and he was absolutely balling through his first 3 games with the Pistons. 24.3 points, 6.3 boards, 1.7 assists, shooting 55.8% from the floor, 47.1% from three-point range. Kind of fell off a little bit during their most recent loss to the Sixers, going 5 of 16 from the field. The Pistons looked incredibly weird during that game overall. But it seems that Stan Van Gundy has kind of recognized that Tobias Harris is his best player now, and this is coming from someone – you could have made that case last year because he ended up being their best player, and that's coming from someone who was in love with KCP for the first half of this season. And the thing that just gets me is how they're kind of varying his usage. Like, he was their best pick-and-roll ball handler last year, basically. But now he leads them in possessions as the roll man for this season, per game. I don't care that it's a small sample size. Like, this is a guy who's doing so many different things for them on a team that really needs this kind of proven, established scorers. We've seen Andre Drummond fall off offensively a little bit, even when he's hitting his free throws. Reggie Jackson, I wouldn't sleep on him coming back all the way, but he's still not quite there yet. This is a guy who's just playing really ridiculously well and has an opportunity with the Pistons in terms of necessities and volume and even resources and the freedom to do things on the offensive end, where it makes me think that he's just going to continue to put up numbers like this. And if you look at what he did for parts of last year with them, this isn't really a surprise. No, maybe he's not going to throw up 24-plus points every night. But when you look at the dearth of talent on the wings in the East and at the 3-4 position, yes, you have Giannis. Yes, you have LeBron. But Gordon Hayward's injured. You lost Butler. You lost Paul George to the Western Conference over the summer. This is a big opportunity for a lot of guys. And I think he's the one who's primed to capitalize on it more than anybody else.
So I think this question probably comes down to, will Indiana or Detroit be a better team by the time we get to the All-Star break? Because I think both of these guys, I have Victor Oladipo for the Indiana Pacers. Both of these guys are going to carry a huge load for their respective teams, and a lot of times it's just win-loss record is a huge factor in All-Star voting. I will throw out some numbers for Victor Oladipo in the spirit of Dan throwing out some numbers for Tobias Harris. You want to talk about a guy who does a lot of different things. Right now, Oladipo for the Pacers is averaging 22 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 3 steals, and a block. And I'm rounding up a little bit on a couple of those. But that's where he's at right now. A lot of that's probably going to regress to the mean a little bit. But this is a guy who does literally a little bit of everything. You get scoring and you get rebounding with Tobias Harris. Let's not pretend that he's going to dish out a bunch of assists this season or play lockdown defense. Victor Oladipo literally covers every base for this Pacers team. He's going to have to. I feel like he was on track to become that kind of player. His box plus minus was slowly ticking up each of his 3 seasons in Orlando. Then he winds up in like the worst situation possible for a developing young shooting guard, just to have to sit and watch Russell Westbrook do what Russell Westbrook does. He wasn't old enough to sort of command possessions the way Paul George and Carmelo Anthony can from Westbrook. So that was a nightmarish situation for him. I feel like his career is right back on the right track again here in Indiana. In fact, I feel like it's on an even better track. He's on a team where he's going to have a ton of responsibility. He's going to put up these counting stats like I've already mentioned. And to go back to my original point, I do think Indiana's probably going to be better this season. I'll take Miles Turner over Andre Drummond every single time. Reggie Jackson is a mess these days. Avery Bradley is fine. I feel like he's kind of overrated, but he's probably one of their better players. Overall, I've said this even going back to our season preview series on the Hardwood Knocks, the delicious podcast, like Brian covered. I think Indiana's going to be fine, and they're in the Eastern Conference. They're going to win a lot of games that they probably wouldn't win if they were in the East or in the West. But overall, I think they are going to be better than the Pistons this year.
So the thing I kind of look for when we're talking about a guy in increased volume, I want to see how it impacts his efficiency. And Victor Oladipo is currently shooting a career worst 40.4% from the field amid career high usage. If you want to go the effective field
percentage is the career high though.
All right, if you want to go effective field goal percentage though, it's the second lowest of his career. So his performance when he's not at the foul line has not been otherworldly. You're looking at a guy whose shooting percentages out of the pick and roll have been on decline for at least the past 3 years. And he hasn't been the best situations, but when your build is kind of this combo guard, that's a huge problem. And like I said, Tobias Harris last year showed a lot of potential as a pick and roll ball handler. Now the Pistons are seeing that they can use him as a roll man. And it's not just because he can dive and has the size to kind of cut through traffic. Like if you give him the ball right off a screen, he's going to make a beeline with it. He looks like the more top guy to me. If they're going to carve out enough minutes for him at the 4, he's going to be okay defensively. And you say Indiana's going to be the better team. I'm just not sure. Like these teams might be, I would say, dead even in that department. And I think that there wouldn't even be a competition then if we're going to say they have the same record at the All-Star break and coaches are going to go with who's better. I picked Tobias Harris going away just because he's the overall better player right now.
All right, last word.
Tobias Harris is a better defender than Victor Oladipo?
I said Tobias Harris is going to be fine if they continue playing him enough minutes at the 4. I'm not calling him a lockdown defender, but he's a better offensive player than Victor Oladipo, and it's not close. It's not particularly close. Victor Oladipo is going to get more assists out of his role. Like Tobias Harris, they're not going to use him in huge volume as a pick and roll ball handler when you have Reggie Jackson back, when you have Ish Smith, when you have Langston Galloway. There are a bunch of guys who are going to run that, and the Pacers, they kind of have to feature Oladipo because he's the centerpiece in that impressively terrible Paul George trade, and that's where a lot of his opportunities are going to come from.
Indiana has Lance make him dance.
I'm saying,
all right. You guys both have done a great job making your points.
Oladipo because they have to justify that stupid Paul George trade.
It's not like Reggie Jackson is demanding possessions from anyone. He's been terrible for like 2 years. If you have a better option.
2015, 2016, Reggie Jackson was terrible.
Okay, all right.
Maybe it was just last year.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Get your shit together.
All right, so after a lot of deliberation, my point, I think, Andy, you did a great job of outlining Victor Oladipo and what he means to the Indiana Pacers, and I agree with what you said originally, and you get an extra point for sucking up and actually listening to the intro. And so, Andy, this point goes to you, talking about Oladipo and who's going to be the better team in the East this year. I think that does have a lot to do with it, especially come All-Star break and All-Star selections. All right, we head into round 4 with Andy holding a 2-1 lead over the returning champ. This question is going to be, what is the best way to fix tanking in the NBA? Andy, who has the lead, is going to start us off, and his answer is to leave everything alone as is. Dan, his answer is some elaborate point system. So, Andy, you're up first.
Yeah, I honestly don't think tanking is that big a deal. I was fully on board when the Sixers did it. I think it's a viable and logical strategy to start over. And look at the Sixers now. I mean, this is now sort of everybody's darling team. They're a blast to watch. They have Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid, a bunch of like top tier talents on one team. I don't know about you guys, but I always love seeing a lot of young talent come together at the same time. It's just fun. It's interesting. There's like an unknown element to it. And I don't really know how tanking affects the overall NBA's bottom line, but the quality of the game is higher than it's ever been. Basketball has never been played at a higher level than it has right now. So I don't think it's impacting the game all that much. Sure, there's going to be 2 or 3 teams every year that are trying to lose games. But to me, it makes sense. Eventually you get to this point, hopefully, that the Sixers are at.
I would agree that tanking isn't some crippling problem in the NBA, but the issue is that not every market can really do it. The Indiana Pacers would be a perfect example, kind of deciding to tread water in mediocrity after the Paul George trade instead of bottoming out, as they should. And if we're talking about ways to potentially improve it, like the whole consolation tournament or mid-season tournament has been thrown out there a lot. So, like, why not just do that without necessarily having the tournament itself where you have to pit the teams who might be tanking or teams out of the playoffs against teams who are also out of the playoffs. Like, once, let's say we roll around to March or March 15th, and whoever's eliminated from playoff contention by that point, we implement a point system. Wins are worth a point, or we weight their records against their strength of schedule. And whoever has the more favorable score relative to those and weighting winning as the more favorable aspect of this equation, then they get the better odds for the lottery. And what you're doing is, okay, teams could technically, I guess, tank their heart out until March, but it doesn't really do anything for them. The worst teams are gonna have to kind of gear up to try and win games once they're eliminated from playoff contention. And I think you would also de-incentivize tanking out of the playoffs if that's even a potential issue for teams that are on the fringes or maybe want a better playoff seed or decide that they don't want to get into the playoffs because they don't want to get bounced in the first round. They'd rather try and get into that lottery tournament or whatever we're going to call it. So if we're going to address it, I like some version of that mid-season consolation tournament idea where you have to force teams that are bad to try and go for wins at some point.
So that was actually one of the options I thought about, the sort of consolation tournament. But I do think there would be teams that are on the sort of fringe of being in the playoffs. Like maybe you're the 8th seed in the West and you think, would I rather get smashed by the Warriors in the first round or dominate all these bad teams in a mid-season tournament and get the number 1 pick?
Right, but since we're not saying like, oh, we're actually going to implement these tournaments against lottery teams versus lottery teams, the 8 seed is going to have problems tanking out of playoff contention that late in the season mathematically. They're not going to be eliminated from like if they're in that conversation.
There'll be 2 or 3 teams that they could get worse than if they wanted to. Just to
but are they going to be mathematically? If you're talking about, but I'm saying like the wins, they wouldn't start to matter until you're mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. So even if you're eliminated more quickly, like the incentive is still to win. So if you're in the 8th spot and let's even say it's February, you're not going to try and lose every game because come around March, you're not going to have enough time to catch up to teams that were more organically, mathematically eliminated. And maybe all it does is solve a quarter season's worth of tanking, but it would be an improvement over, I guess, what we have now.
Do you think it's bad the way it is now? Like, do you think it's negatively impacting the game?
I think it creates more of an imbalance with the way that teams rebuild because once again, it seems like it can favor bigger markets. Like the Bulls can tank their hearts out and are still going to turn a profit, whereas a team like Phoenix or Indiana is not going to be able to do that. Yeah, you know what? Phoenix is doing it now, but I don't think that that's necessarily deliberate. Like this is a team that's trying to go for it for a little bit, and maybe that small market, they have a loyal fan base and they're going to appreciate something that happened naturally. But a Sixers team, what they did, that you can't replicate that in Indiana. What the Bulls are clearly doing now, you can't do that. And these smaller markets, Oklahoma City is not going to be able to do that. Like maybe for a year, we're talking about a team like Philly that did it for, it feels like basically a half decade. And that's not going to be, that's an extreme, but you want to try and eliminate that extreme is what we would be after in adjusting any of the tanking modules right now.
All right. I think you guys did a great job of explaining your points. Andy, I love how you always turn the table on Dan and put these questions on him to see if he'll kind of box himself out. I love that strategy. Dan, I think that the point system that you're talking about, could have some positive intended effects on avoiding tanking, but in the end, it might award those mediocre teams like Andy was pointing out. And I agree with Andy that tanking isn't that big of an issue in the NBA right now. I mean, of course, you have the occasional team, but for the most part, teams are trying to remain competitive. So, yep, throw him up there, Andy. He takes a 3-1 lead going into the lightning round. All right, so we head into the lightning round, and Andy holds a 3-1 lead over Dan. The way the lightning round works is each competitor will only get 30 seconds to answer the question. So Dan's going to start us off with this round, so he's going to get 30 seconds. Andy's going to get 30 seconds to rebuttal, and then we'll come back to Dan for 10 last seconds to try to convince myself, ultimately, that he deserves a point. So the question for this round is, who's going to finish the season with a better record, the Chicago Bulls or the Phoenix Suns? Dan, he's going to go first. He picked the Chicago Bulls. Andy, he has the Phoenix Suns. So Dan, as soon as you start talking, the clock will start walking.
I don't even think this is really a question at this point, especially in light of the Eric Bledsoe trade demand via Twitter. The Suns have lost their first 3 games by an average of 30-plus points, 2 of which came by 40-plus points. You're going to remove Eric Bledsoe from the equation. Even if he's not traded, he's not with the team anymore. The offense isn't good to begin with. Their numbers without him, they were barely average. They were a little bit below average when he was on the floor. Remove him from the equation, and you're banking on a leap from Devin Booker with a team that still isn't necessarily built to be efficient on the offensive end. At least the Bulls also play in the East, whereas Phoenix is going to play in that brutal West.
All right. So, Andy, you're up.
I will admit that my argument becomes the Eric Bledsoe shenanigans that have taken place in the last couple of days. I will lean on Devin Booker, who, despite the advanced stats hating him so much, I think has star potential. I don't think you can say that about anybody on the Bulls. I don't even know how many viable NBA players they have.
All right, so you guys both made very solid points. We're going to throw it back to Dan for 10 final seconds.
I mean, Derek Butler probably has the highest ceiling of anyone on these 2 rosters right now, but what does that mean? Like, the advanced numbers are still going to matter, and at least the Bulls, they have an NBA player in Robin Lopez. Like, they have Zach LaVine might come back and be better than we thought, and maybe he'll be better than Devin Booker.
All right. So, Andy, I think you made a really good point there about Devin Booker clearly being the best player on both of these teams. However, Dan, I think you made the better point about they already lost a couple of games by 40-plus points, and Eric Bledsoe, one of their best players, will probably no longer be on the roster and has probably played his last game in Phoenix. So, Dan, you take the point, and you now trail 2 points to 3.
Sorry, Suns fans, I failed you.
We head into round 6 with Andy holding a slim 3-2 lead over Dan. And this is another version of the lightning round, and the question is, who is going to finish the season with a better record, the Oklahoma City Thunder or the Houston Rockets? Andy's going to kick this round off, and he has the Houston Rockets. Dan, he's going to go first with the Oklahoma City Thunder. So Andy, whenever you're ready.
So I think this has as much to do with the Thunder as the Rockets. I don't think those pieces fit together quite as seamlessly as James Harden and Chris Paul do. I get that it didn't look perfect in that first game, but they did beat the Warriors in Oracle. And I really like the idea of Mike D'Antoni having 48 minutes of elite point guard play, something he's never had before. I think that offense is going to be absurd when Chris Paul comes back and gets acclimated. And I think figuring out the shot distribution between Paul George, Carmelo Anthony, and Russell Westbrook is going to be a season-long struggle.
All right. Dan, your 30 seconds.
I mean, let's see Chris Paul play for more than 3/4 of a game, basically, first before we go there. If his knee problem, if they keep him out a month, now you're saddling James Harden with all these additional burdens. And who's your backup then when Chris Paul's out? Like you have Bobby Brown and Demetrius Jackson, basically. The Thunder, I look to their struggles as sort of a silver lining. They're still a top 7 defense right now, and it's the offense that ranks in the bottom 10 of efficiency. It's not going to stand. And we saw it kind of work a little bit, the offensive balance in crunch time against the Timberwolves. You had Melo and Paul George standing around. Maybe that's a problem, but it worked. Russell Westbrook scored a ton. Melo hit what would have been a game winner if Andrew Wiggins didn't hit that huge shot.
All right, you're past your time. I got to cut you off. Sorry, Dan. Usually you're pretty good at that. So, Andy, you get 10 last seconds to rebuttal.
So I didn't even mention the upgraded wings. Luka Richard and Bam Mute and PJ Tucker. I think they're both going to help a lot, too. That'll improve their defense.
All right, perfect. Dan, you made a really good point there about the Oklahoma City Thunder and their improved defense. That has been an underrated part of their game so far, and you know the offense is going to come around with those 3 superstars. As has been the theme, though, Andy just one-upped you. He made a good point about the Rockets pieces fitting that much better than the Thunder. And so, Andy, you officially take this one 4-2. It was a 4-2 lead going into the final round, making it impossible for Dan to come back and win this. This round is basically for pride and shits and giggles. So the question is, who is going to have the better record, the Philadelphia 76ers or the New Orleans Pelicans? Dan is going to go first. He has the Philadelphia 76ers. Andy, you're going to go second. You have the New Orleans Pelicans. So Dan, whenever you're ready.
The Sixers are deeper than the Pelicans. They play in a crappier conference, and you look at what Ben Simmons has been able to do just starting his career. He's basically a nightly triple-double threat, and he has a bunch of players around him, some of whom you know are going to improve. Markelle Fultz being one of them. Same with Joel Embiid and his catch-and-shoot percentage. And then the Pelicans barely can field an NBA roster around Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins. How does that fly out west?
It hasn't flown great so far, but I still think having 2 of the 4 or 5 best big men in the league is going to win out for them. When those 2 are on the floor together so far this season, even though they're 1 and 2, they are plus 10 per 100 possessions with those 2. Davis is averaging 32 and 17. Cousins is averaging 28, 12, and 5. That sort of elite talent at the top, I think, is going to be good for more wins than the Sixers.
All right, we're now going to throw it back to Dan for an additional 10-second rebuttal.
I just don't that 2-man game. Yeah, that's good. But what are you going to do with the rest of the rosters around them aside from Drew Holiday? The Sixers are deeper, and that depth will come together as the season goes on.
All right, very good points. I think the duo of Cousins and Anthony Davis are unstoppable, but Dan, you made some really good points about playing in the East, that depth helping the 76ers. So Dan, you take this point and make it look like a close game as unfortunately you're unable to defend your championship and you fall 4-3 to Andy.
I need a championship belt or something.
We'll have to look into our budget to see if that works. So that's a wrap for today's episode. Andy Bailey is your winner. You can find him on Twitter at Andrew D. Bailey. The loser of today's episode is Dan Favale. He'll go down in history books as a nobody. So if you want to follow a nobody, go ahead and follow Dan on Twitter at Dan Favale. As for me, I'm your host, Brian Sampson. You can find me on Twitter at Brian Sampson NBA. And we're proud to present the second ever episode of BasketBrawl presented to you by NBA Math. And remember, only the best points survive.